There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Your Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, and I have got, and I'm excited to say this, I have Mike frickin' McGrady.
Hey. He's got a big old beard.
I do. It's gray, but it's there.
It wasn't
Grizzled.
gray. Last time we saw it, it wasn't gray.
Yeah, it's been that way for a couple of years.
Last time we saw him, he didn't have a beard. Last time we saw him, he was 3 years younger.
That's right.
I feel like we haven't recorded a podcast with Mike in a long time.
Literally just got back in from the wilderness, like an hour before you guys showed up.
It must be great to be able to go on vacations.
It is.
You're such
Actually,
a
it was
slacker.
well deserved and awesome. So yeah, no, it was great. Yeah, no, I had to take the family camping, kind of an annual thing now.
Well, thanks for showing up for this. It would have been a little awkward for us to be recording in your house.
I liked it when you weren't here.
Yeah, it was better when you were recording at my house and I wasn't.
Did you find that thing yet?
No.
Just checking.
You will.
I'm waiting for the odor to really kick in. Whatever that thing is, I don't know, but I'm sure it'll smell.
Oh, it'll be great.
Yeah, I
Can't wait.
I
Did you
think
find the possum yet? No.
you'll know it when you know it. And of course, everybody just heard Nephi's here too, which means we have a full team tonight.
Yes, it's good to be here, Dave.
Trifecta.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I'm glad we're all here. I got to tell you a quick story, which I think will segue nicely into our topic today.
It better.
It will, I promise.
Okay.
And it builds off of something that, Nephi, that you were saying in one of our last episodes. You know, we had been talking about this need for like putting partisanship aside and having real conversations.
It's an ongoing theme for me.
So listen to this.
Okay.
All right. So I'm in central Idaho last week. I was there most of the week, and for a family thing. And I was doing this hike, climbing this mountain with my cousin, who is, and I'm hoping he's listening. I think I've convinced him to listen to this podcast too. So
you can't convince family to listen to your podcast.
Right, it's trouble, right? So Tony, if you're listening, thanks for
5
listening.
stars.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So he and I were on this, doing this climb, and I was also with my brother-in-law as well, my sister's husband. And so he's from Seattle, the Seattle area, and he is one of the most liberal people I have ever known.
Mm-hmm. He's in Antifa.
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
But he's incredibly liberal. But we had this incredible conversation over this 3,000-foot climb to the top of Norton Peak in the Smoky Mountains of Idaho. And it was centered around the urban-rural divide. He spent his entire life in urban centers all over the country, and that's what he's been exposed to. And we started having a discussion about some of the differences between urban centers and rural areas. And we're really talking about the 2016 election in a lot of ways, and what gave the momentum to elect Trump, right? And how so much of that came from folks in rural areas feeling like they've been ignored and underrepresented. So we had a long conversation about that. He has his own blog. Today he wrote a blog about that experience and how the conversations we had opened him up. He said, we're not going to agree on everything, but it opened him up to thoughts that he had never been thinking about before. And he's really started thinking about this urban-rural divide and the need to have real conversations and truly try and understand what,
well, that's one.
Issues. So, and it only took me all day climbing a mountain.
Next.
And we're never going to agree. We're just not. Right?
Yeah.
Wow.
But I say that because it was such a valuable experience for me, and it's in line with what you were talking about, Nephi, about this need to really put the politics aside and really listen and understand what people are thinking about.
I've given up on that now.
Okay. Well, I haven't. It's reinforced my
too
conviction in it. This experience, it reinforced my conviction in it. Because it's easy to fight with family, right? So if you can actually have a good dialogue with family.
Did you
there's
say
a
it
chance.
was your cousin?
It was my cousin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying they were an in-law. It was really easy to fight with an in-law.
No, this is a cousin. But this is what it leads into. I want to read a few headlines for you, and this kind of
All right.
take us into our topic for the day. All right. So this is from the New York Times. Headline: The Species Act, endangered, like a plan from a cartoon villain. That's a headline. Scientists decry ignorance of rolling back species protection in the midst of a mass extinction. That's the Washington Post.
Wait. The scientists were ignorant of what?
No, they
No,
decried.
scientists decry ignorance,
Yeah.
in quotes,
Oh,
ignorance
okay,
in quotes,
okay.
of rolling back species protection in the midst of a mass extinction. The Trump administration finds a new target, endangered species. And it goes on from here, right? There are, you just Google Endangered Species Act revisions and see the types of headlines. U.S., again, New York Times, U.S. significantly weakens Endangered Species Act. Vox, the Endangered Species Act trumps new rules weaken
It's
biodiversity
almost as
protections.
if everyone looks at these things through a partisan lens,
Even
even though they're supposed to be objective media. It's amazing.
So it's actually pretty remarkable, the consistency in the headline. And then when you actually read the articles or the opinion pieces, as they might be, everybody that's being reached out to for comment, it's the same people that are commenting on all of these articles, right? The same half a dozen, whatever, folks that are commenting on all of these. So my reason for bringing this up is if you were to just read the headlines from just about any news source last week, early in the week, you'd think,
This is the
holy
worst thing
smokes,
ever.
what just happened to the Endangered Species Act, right?
Yeah.
You think, boy, what did the administration do? Right?
I thought that you would have been.
if you had not been paying attention the last 2 years or 3. Yeah, you might think, oh my goodness, something major just actually happened.
Yeah. If you hadn't listened to our podcast before, because we've talked about the impending regulatory changes.
Yeah.
Or if you
before.
actually didn't spend time actually figuring out that the Endangered Species Act hasn't been reauthorized in like 20 years and maybe there's some things that are broken.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Well,
30 years, actually.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it does not surprise me to hear headlines where it's suddenly this major problem that no one knew about, and it was one person targeting it as if it was just, anyways.
For political expediency.
Yeah, it just, anyways.
That's the
it was-
disappointing thing. And I'll we'll get to the actual nuts and bolts, but come on, everybody.
Yeah, because
Like so many things, this totally got politicized. And for those people that jumped on the bandwagon and started throwing, bombs at somebody, and literally because they didn't like the administration,
There are action
This is
alerts. There are
ridiculous.
actions. So we should.
they're fundraisers, you said?
Yeah, action alerts /
Oh, okay.
fundraisers.
All
Yeah.
right.
So
it's just disappointing
hang-
because at some point people
Hang on, before you
Okay, go
get
ahead,
into
I'm
that,
sorry.
let me tell people what we're talking about, because I've read a bunch of headlines, but we haven't actually said what it is we're talking about.
Yes.
the endangered.
So-
Go ahead. Yeah.
So the source of these headlines are at the beginning of last week, the Trump administration, through Secretary David Bernhardt, the Secretary of Interior.
So middle August 2019.
Right.
Okay.
Middle of August 2019, published in the Federal Register final rules that amended the implementing regulations for the Endangered Species Act.
We're not talking about changes in law. We're talking about some changes in the
The
implementing
statute
regulations.
itself is word for word
The same.
as it was last week, the same as it was last year, the
Didn't
same
go
as it
anywhere.
was 15 years ago. It's the same. The implementing regulations, which are periodically amended by
What?
No, right?
Yeah.
I can't think of the last administration that did not amend the implementing regulations in some way
Of the Endangered
of the
Species
Endangered
Act?
Species Act. It happens.
Eisenhower.
Kennedy
Yeah,
definitely didn't.
Lincoln. Yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't do it either.
Okay. In my lifetime,
Yeah.
the implementing
since it's been around.
since it's been around, the implementing regulations have been amended. I think it's safe to say, for sure, routinely, and I can't think of a president, an administration that did not do it. So this was this administration's turn to amend these regulations. They've been proposing the amendments for about 18 months. I mean, they've been talking about them. They went out for a round of comment. The comment period was extended. They got tens of thousands of comments on these regulations. We've talked about them on the podcast. They were published. And the immediate reaction, and I'm talking within minutes and hours, the immediate reaction across the media was, the sky is falling, the act has been gutted, this administration is out to cater to industry. And
Are you saying that they may have clicked print on their pre-typed out reports?
I think that's pretty
With
safe.
talking points?
Pretty safe bet. That never happens either.
No.
I've never seen that happen before.
I can tell you though that we've all looked at these things. We've all worked on these things. We've all worked with the people that worked on these things, and understand that there is no evil man in a cartoon mask or whatever out to get the Endangered Species Act, and so those types of headlines are laughable.
That's the funny part, is when you look at this and kind of this idea that, somebody just, Bernhardt just showed up with in a car and took out a box that he had in his trunk with some stuff that he invented. And what people need to understand is these responses, these changes in rules, these things didn't just appear out of thin air where that somebody, this wasn't on a memo from some guy at an oil company that said, hey, I'd like you to change these 5 things. We're talking about years and years of discussion and work and back and forth. And people, that is lost on people because it would require work to understand those things. And you couldn't just lazily type something out and then hit send.
So we're not going to go into great detail about this. And I'm going to preface this discussion with, could these changes weaken the Endangered Species Act? And the answer to that is, like any regulatory change, yes. It all depends on how the regulations are implemented.
And some of them in specific ways. And we can talk about that, and we can kind of touch on that.
But on the flip side is, could these regulatory changes actually make species conservation better?
Let's talk about how.
And the answer to that is yes. And it depends on how these regulations are implemented. So it's hard for me to, I hate this idea of saying the sky is falling before the ink is dry on the page, right? When if you actually sit down and I'm guessing virtually everybody that says the sky is falling hasn't actually sat down and read the regulations cover to cover like I have, right? The sky's not falling. But let's talk about some of. So there are a lot of.
You mind doing a
changes
pro and a con, doing one and then the other, saying what's a good thing, what's a bad.
Yeah, we can do that. And I'm only going to pick out. So there's
talk
something
about
like 36 regulatory changes in these series. I think it's 3 different regulatory. 3 different Federal Register entries. So 3 different notices and. Dealing with the implementing regulations, and in total there are about 36 very specific changes to implementation. We're going to talk about a handful of them. So let me take the biggest one. What I think is the biggest one out there, and it is maybe you guys disagree, and if you disagree, tell me which one you think is bigger. I think the biggest regulatory change in this entire package is the removal of what's been called the blanket 4D protection.
Explain that.
Now, yeah. So here's what that is. Back in 1973, when the Endangered Species Act was passed, it was passed with 2 categories of listed species, threatened and endangered. And they had there were different levels of protection applied to threatened as there were endangered, and as you might expect, an endangered species had the highest level of protection and take prohibitions in the act, that sort of thing. So it was more restrictive. Well, and I'm going to get the year, I'll probably get the year wrong. It was either in the late 70s or early 80s. There was a regulation put in place. I think it was the late 70s. I think it was the Carter administration that did this. Put in place a regulation that was what they called the blanket 4D, which meant when a species, any species that is listed would be subject to, and by blanket 4D, I mean, so 4D is a section of the Endangered Species Act, right? And this 4D rule, this rule written under Section 4D, would apply to any listed species. Any species listed as threatened under the Act would be subject to this blanket rule, which would give it all of the same protections as if it were listed as endangered. So functionally, when that 4D, blanket 4D rule was put in place, the distinction between threatened and endangered that was in the Act, that Congress put in the Act, was eliminated. And there was really one classification. They were listed as threatened but treated as endangered unless you wrote a species-specific 4D rule that lessened those restrictions, which they've done for many species, right? So this blanket 4D rule repeal, what it does is it just goes back and says, we're going to say there's a distinction between threatened and endangered, and if you want to have additional restrictions, you can write a species-specific 4D rule that puts additional restrictions in place, and it, up to how you would treat a species as though if it were listed as endangered. I probably explained that in a very complicated way.
You did. It was very wonky. Is there a way you can do it like in 3 sentences using 2 kinds of birds that people understand?
Let me put it to you this way.
Grizzly
bears.
National
Let's talk
Park.
about grizzly bears just quickly as an example. Grizzly bears were listed as a threatened species, but they were subject to the blanket 4D. So grizzly bears were listed as threatened, but functionally treated as endangered. Right. This rule, and actually, this is another kind of wonky piece. It doesn't apply to anything retroactively.
Yes.
It's only applying from here on out.
Yes.
But if say wolves in Wyoming were relisted in the future, now I'm bouncing to wolves, but say they were relisted in the future, they would not be subject to this blanket 4D. They could be listed as threatened, and there would be less restriction on them.
You'd have more flexibility.
There'd be more flexibility,
you'd be able to manage.
right? And you could place additional restrictions through the use of a species-specific 4D rule.
Why is this a good thing that this happened?
So there are 2 trains of thought, and you want
let's
to
hear
do
'em.
plus and minus, right?
Yep.
So on the plus side, it has the potential to create additional flexibility. So for one thing, take prohibitions of the Act, which means you can't harm or hurt or harass or kill or whatever an endangered species. Those only apply to endangered species. They've applied to threatened under the blanket 4D rule. That won't apply anymore. So the take prohibitions won't apply unless you write a rule that specifically makes them apply. But one of the things that this can do is it can create more flexibility, and it can create an opportunity for some innovative conservation on the ground. Because you don't have the same level of restrictions, you don't have to jump through quite as many hoops, you can get conservation plans
You can
in
be
place.
more inventive in how you work to conserve.
You can be
species
more
before
inventive, and
it's
you can do
endangered.
it quicker.
Yep.
For implementing, and it's going to require fewer hurdles to jump through.
So if you're a state or an organization that's working on a species that you're trying to keep from getting to that, threatened endangered area, now you have greater flexibility, more capacity to potentially help that species before it falls over the edge.
Here's another thing too. Think about if you're a landowner and you have an endangered species on your land, right? Knowing that the take prohibitions apply to endangered but not threatened, and there's lesser restriction, the restrictions are lessened for a threatened species, it creates an incentive to get conservation on the ground for that endangered species to get them at least downlisted to threatened.
And for people
So
that don't
you have
understand
more
what
flexibility.
take is, Mike, really quickly, what's the take provision? So when somebody says take, like take an endangered species, that doesn't mean somebody's going to go hunt it, just for people that don't know.
Well, David just said it. He defined take as basically threaten, harass, harm, kill. I mean, it's not just shoot. It's
Yes.
Right.
it could
Accidental
be a number
death.
If you hit it,
Yes.
if you hit it with a car accidentally,
Or your
if you
lawnmower.
if you till up a field and
Yes.
that destroys habitat, the loss of that habitat is a
taking
take.
rather than, and so that's important because I think a lot of people, I know for me, before I got heavily involved in endangered species, like somebody's take,
Yeah,
there's some, you need
just
to understand
thought-
what that is.
Yeah. So that was what I'd say are some of the positives, right? It creates additional flexibility. It creates additional incentive, right? So
It sounds like just in reading Section 4D is it applies the act as Congress passed,
yes,
rather than
and
just this blanket. Okay, we're always going to treat everything like it's endangered, even if it's not.
Right.
It's more tailored to the needs of that particular species for the conservation
So what do
needs
you
of that
think-
species.
What do you
it's
think-
been done? Because the Endangered Species Act, there are two agencies that implement the act.
Right.
You have Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Commerce. Secretary of Commerce through the National Marine Fisheries Service implements it. They don't have that same blanket 4D rule. They never have. They've always done it the way Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing to go back and do it now.
To create the uniformity between the two agencies.
I don't know that that's the intent. That's part of it, but
It's gonna be that
Do you
way.
remember
It's
why
gonna
the
be that way.
blanket 4D was put in there originally? I don't. I'm just wondering if you do. It seems like a paperwork expediency to me, but I don't know.
Yeah, it might be. I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know. I'd have to do a little bit of digging.
Well, I mean,
can
if
find
that's,
it
if
out.
that's something folks are curious about, we can dig in.
Yeah.
So what pushed people to make this decision? So what do you think is the, so I'm trying to, and if you can do this quickly. So on this point, we got, if we're going to touch a few of
Yeah.
them, what's the impetus for Interior to say we need to do this?
So a couple of things. One is, let's make the act. Let's get back to what Congress intended the act to be, and Congress intended there to be differences here. Another piece is we want to be able to be more nimble in responding to specific species needs, more flexible, and as Mike pointed out, be able to tailor a rule to a specific species in a way that can be provide the most flexibility and benefit to that species, rather than a blanket provision that the one size fits. Get away from the one size fits all approach to a species specific approach, right? So that's some of the impetus for it.
So you asked me you asked us what we thought were, some more impactful. I think the definition of foreseeable future is more impactful. And I could be wrong, but I think that's important. I think it could be more important in the future. What do you think about that?
You see it foreseeable to be important in the future? Yeah. Crystal ball.
I'm not going to tell you how far in the future I think that the definition of foreseeable future
I think
is
that
important.
certainly is an interesting piece because I know I've litigated the what does foreseeable future mean for a particular species, and there's all these different. Always been debate over what's the right time frame, what's the right thing what marker to use, and it can vary by species. So
Well, look,
it's an interesting one.
Stellar sea lion is 99
So what did Interior?
years.
Yeah.
So what's the new
Polar bear
rule?
is 50 years or something like
Yeah.
that.
So what's the new rule? What's the nutshell?
So the funny thing is, the new rule is, in effect, the old rule. I mean, so we had a solicitor's opinion in 2009.
That can't be true because I heard Trump was trying to kill endangered species.
I know, that's what the headlines would make you believe, right?
Yeah, right.
So there was a solicitor's opinion in 2009 that was written in response to litigation about defining foreseeable future.
So the courts go to Interior and say, "Hey, you guys need to do a better job of defining this."
Right, and so they do through this secretarial memo, right? They this opinion define foreseeable future, and we should be clear what foreseeable future is, right? It's making a determination on whether a species is likely to become threatened or endangered in the foreseeable future.
Whatever that means.
Right, whatever foreseeable means, right? So how do you define that?
Bit of moving
Or
target.
on the delisting side, when you delist and say it will be recovered for the foreseeable future, what does that mean? So they wrote this. The Solicitor General wrote this opinion, right? There's an S opinion or an M opinion, I can't remember which one, from 2009.
It is an M opinion.
And an M
written
opinion.
January 16th,
Tell everybody what an M
2009.
opinion means.
It's a memorandum.
It's a memorandum, yeah.
Okay.
Opinion from the attorney, the main attorney for the Department of the Interior.
So not the solicitor.
As opposed to an S opinion, which is
not the solicitor.
Not the Solicitor General.
It's
the
solicitor
solicitor
of the
of the
United States Department of the Interior.
Correct.
Who happened to be one David Longley Bernhardt.
the thick Plottins.
Yeah, right. I mean, he wasn't the only one writing it. But
No, but so it was written during the last Bush administration, but it was applied and never changed during the entire Obama administration. It was used throughout the Obama administration for defining foreseeability. So what does this regulation do? It takes that opinion.
it just codifies
and
what was the
effectively codifies what that
what
opinion
was
was into regulation, into some sort of
Yes.
law, right?
So it's not like this didn't come
It's
out
not
of
groundbreaking.
Yes, this has been around for a long time in different administrations with different, capital letters next to people's names.
Yep, not groundbreaking.
Okay, pros, cons.
I really,
There's nothing that's con.
it's like the same thing it's always been, right? The
Yeah,
pro
it's
is that
just-
it gives some
that it
some
codifies
sideboards. It
what was
codifies
already
it, yeah,
there,
and it gives some
and-
sideboards to what the
Yes.
discussion is about
Okay.
foreseeability. The con is, for some people, it might not be specific enough, and it's still very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach for foreseeability because species are also
But
different.
just know that as the sky is falling and the house is burning down, this was one of the matches for, oh my gosh, the house is burning down because of this too.
Yeah, but this has been implemented for a decade, and think
Yes.
about some of the species that have been listed under.
Might I say how bad it is for credibility to take an argument like this and then act like this is a big deal?
Yeah, yeah. Now the 4D one, we never said any of the cons on the 4D change, right? One of the big cons to that, and just very briefly, is that, and the argument I've heard is that you take something that, in the current, before this rule was in place, you had a 4D rule, the blanket 4D, and you might write a species-specific 4D, but the species-specific 4D would be lessening. It would be reducing restriction, right, and regulation. Now, any 4D rule would be adding restriction, and so there's some concern that because you'd be adding restriction now as opposed to removing restriction, that there'll be a lot more resistance to 4D rules, to having species-specific 4D rules.
Yeah, no, it's harder to add on restrictions than it is to be generous and remove.
Right.
Right.
And so the fear is they just won't write these 4D rules because there'd be such opposition to adding on restrictions. And because they won't do the species-specific 4D rules, like we talked about, that if you do them, you have a lot more ability to tailor them to specific species needs and aid species recovery, that maybe they won't do them and it will have a negative impact on species. And that's a possible outcome. That is a possible outcome. And it's just going to take holding people accountable in positions of authority to make sure that doesn't happen. Right. But that's the negative piece of that. Right. So I just wanted to make sure, because you asked what's the positive and negative, and we never touched on the negative. What's the next topic? So we've done foreseeability.
I think
we've
the
done
next
4D.
important one to talk about is just with this rule, we now know that you follow the same standard for delisting as you do for listing.
That's
so
huge.
The rules of the road, the game, goalpost doesn't move depending on whether you're listing or delisting.
Well, now, yeah, because the goalposts have never moved on the listing side, have they?
Oh, right. Yeah, I know. But it just it would seem funny that the rules would be set up that you can get on the list easily, but it's
very
impossible to
hard
get off, right?
Yes.
And we're going to hold you to a different standard. That just doesn't seem right.
So the idea was, it was, and the standard is there in Section 4, there are 5 factors that you have to, you don't have to list, you just have to show that one of the 5 factors applies. Like, it's at risk of being threatened or endangered because of habitat degradation or disease, or check one box, not 5. So now you're just having
one
to
of
show
those boxes basically show that the species is either threatened or endangered.
Right.
Right.
So
Which we covered all this stuff in
We did.
episodes
Go back
9,
and listen
11,
to
and
that.
13.
So on the flip side, on the delisting side, now it's just saying that 5-factor test applies to delisting as well. So if you look at those 5 factors and none of them would suggest that the species is it warrants being listed as threatened or endangered, that it should be delisted. And you don't have to do this separate. What they've been doing is this separate, detailed a justification analysis. I can't even. They were doing more than they had to do. Let's just put it that way.
Sure.
And so they're clarifying that.
Yeah.
That they don't have to do that as much. So that's a piece in here. There's another piece in here about the way in which they would designate critical habitat for species.
Right.
That one's a lot more complicated. We won't go into a lot of detail about that. But they changed it. It creates more certainty, but it also creates some.
So what was uncertain before, David? Critical habitat to me sounds like the things that are the most critical to a species.
Yeah, I think you want to
And
answer.
yet, there was some things that were not habitat. They were
But they could be
maybe
someday,
or
if-
they were not even occupied, but
they could be
maybe someday.
someday.
Right. So there were some court decisions that kind of muddied the waters on what really constituted critical habitat.
Yeah, and to be clear, this rule still allows for identifying critical habitat of unoccupied habitat.
Right. And I think that's contemplated in
And
the Act.
It's contemplated in the Act, and it's
Yeah.
been applied that way. There, a lot of critical habitat designations designate areas.
So what's the big deal and
including
what's the change?
Occupied and unoccupied.
what's
Yeah,
the
so but
change?
I mean, occupied, unoccupied, and unoccupied indicates that it could be occupied as habitat. But there have been instances in litigation history in which species never even went near there.
Right. So you're talking
And-
Mexican wolves in particular.
Some other things.
Yeah,
But
mainly
there's
Mexican wolves,
also, the ideas of, well, someday climate change may move the habitat for butterfly up the mountain.
In the
And
Well,
so
that was-
we're going to designate that way up on the
Yeah.
peak.
Foreseeable future.
That was kind of the idea behind this Weyerhaeuser case with the dusky gopher frog, I think is what it was. That just went to the Supreme Court last year. And the outgrowth of that case is really, some of what's in this rule. Right. So the dusky gopher frog, I think I've got that species, right? But they
I love that name.
Right.
ahead.
They'd established
Not as good as slick-spotted peppergrass.
they'd established all of this critical
Maybe
habitat
better.
For the dusky gopher frog in a critical habitat designation where they didn't exist and never existed and couldn't possibly exist.
Yeah.
And that went to the court, and the court said, in order to have critical habitat, you actually have to have habitat.
But
That's
what is habitat?
But what is habitat? And
Right.
so now they've directed the secretary to define habitat, and they took a stab at dipping their toe in the water on it in this regulation. They're going to have to do further
So the
rulemaking
courts
around
told the secretary that you need to do this, and then he did it?
No.
No.
Okay, I'm just
No, he hasn't done it yet.
okay.
He hasn't done it yet.
Yeah, so to be clear, in the package that was just finalized here, there's only discussions around the idea of what habitat is, but it just doesn't define it to the point of answering a lot of these things that we're still
Exactly.
talking about and arguing about.
But it does clear up that, at least for purposes of listing, and there's some debate about whether this is the right way to do it or not. I'm just saying this is the approach that was pointed out, is that for critical habitat designations, they have to be able to show that that habitat is necessary for the conservation of the species. And you shouldn't designate critical habitat as critical if it's not necessary to the conservation of the species. Right. And it laid out a whole list of criteria for that. It also listed out criteria. It's contemplated in the Act that you don't have to designate critical habitat. So it says you should unless you can't, or unless there's a compelling reason not to. And so this rule lays out the reasons for not designating critical habitat. And so all of those things are in there. So there's a school of thought that thinks this is going to make it harder by limiting the habitat to just what's necessary to maintain a population, not necessarily recover it, that we might make it harder to recover species by limiting this
Limiting the amount.
definition too much.
What about economic analysis?
Yep.
You want to talk about that? Because I know that that's a big one that a lot of people, almost all the articles, everybody knows this if you've read anything about it at all. This idea that now we're going to do economic analysis as part of our determination of, not as part of our determination, I apologize. We're going to do an economic analysis to help us understand things. That's not going to affect our determination of whether or not a species is listed, but we're going to do an economic analysis.
So let me, if I can
Go ahead.
kind of clarify that just a little
Yes.
bit. So they don't have to do an economic analysis. What this rule does is it gives them the option.
There's an executive order that requires all agencies to do an economic analysis of their rules,
Right.
which is
that's
different than this particular analysis.
Yes, that's different. So this
I just want
analysis.
to clarify, they
Yeah, okay.
do have an obligation. It's just the way they go about it doesn't answer the actual question what we all care about.
Right. Of what's the economic impact of listing a species? Or uplisting a species, or downlisting a species, or delisting a species. What's the economic impact? Principally of the listing side. So this rule says, yep, you don't have to, but the service can do an economic analysis when making a listing determination. Now, to be clear, we had the very first U.S. Supreme Court case that was decided about the Endangered Species Act, which was the Tennessee Valley Authority v. Hill. We've talked about that in this case. Right? The very first case that was decided said economics cannot be a factor, don't matter in making
The
determination.
listing decision.
And this administration reaffirmed that in their rulemaking and said, we recognize that we cannot
List or not list a species based on these economics.
allow these economic analysis to influence our decision making.
And that's the way it is.
So there's definitely concern out there that even though they've said they can't do it, that it will be hard to prove that they didn't do it.
The concern is that when the information is out there someplace, somebody will be considering it in the back of their mind, even if they're not.
Or it'll be used against the act or against the species in some way in the future.
Right.
Go ahead.
If you have that information out there, this is going to cost us X amount, big number, whatever it is, or maybe it's a small number, we don't know. If we do something in conservation related to this species, and when you start throwing numbers around, you start aggregating numbers, and you could have folks that are advocating that our economy could be booming and doing wonderful if we just got rid of this one act.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Well,
It could be used to
some great
weaponize
examples out there. The endangered
efforts to gut the Endangered Species Act. It could be.
It certainly
Yeah.
could.
It absolutely could be.
Absolutely. And that's, and again, recognize that what we're talking about is a tertiary thing that we're talking about, potentially somebody saying, like, I fear that if we have economic data, that economic data could then potentially be misused by somebody outside of this process to attack the act
Right.
itself.
Your
And so that's the
first two
concern.
words are the key right
I
there.
fear.
I fear.
Yes.
That additional information out there will cause people to do things.
There's also a fear of how it will be used internally as well. So you point out, and we were just talking about how it might be used externally as a weapon, but there's also fear, and again, it's whether it's well-founded or not, I'm just explaining that there is fear that it can be used. It won't be used to make a listing determination because it can't be. But that doesn't mean that it can't be used in other areas.
I have a
of
hard time believing
ESA
that.
implementation.
Because there's
I don't.
already the fear
You're
that the decision is going to have some economic consequence, and the difference is this is just going to put a number to that fear. And if there is if there is external pressure on these folks in making their decision, that's there now. We just don't know what the actual number is.
No, they just don't have a number to actually understand it. And we talked about this a little bit before we went on there. So I'll say, one of the challenges about this is, in my mind, and we don't have to agree, you can tell me where you think I'm wrong. One of the challenges of some of the acts that came out along with the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, is this concept that we have, that of infinite value and equality and those things, while they are noble goals, for example, all species have infinite value and equality, and they're all priceless. That's great. That's a great, noble idea for all of us to have. But the reality is, our pocketbook isn't infinite. Our country, even with all of our wealth, we're looking at all these different species that we want to save. When I spend every $1 million I spend on a wolf is $1 million that I don't get to spend on a black-footed ferret, or $1 million that I don't get to spend on some other species that nobody cares about because it's not a charismatic megafauna, and I can't buy something that looks like it in a pet store. And that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, or on Social Security.
Yeah, our budgets aren't that big.
Whatever.
Well, so I'm not going to stake out a position on the podcast, but I'm going to put it this way.
Hold on. So the only reason I'm saying this for people to think that I'm not saying that this, that I'm just saying that there is value to understanding what things cost. And so I'm just saying, as an argument for, get some economic analysis. I'm not saying that we should, make all decisions based on dollars and cents. I'm saying that an understanding of that should go into intelligent decision making, because we do have limited resources.
So yeah, and I just offer a counter to that, right? So one of the things that there could be concern about is, okay, under the act, what should obviously we have limited resources. We all know we have limited financial resources. And if you look at the way recovery dollars are spent right now on all the 1,600 plus species listed in the United States, there are hundreds of species that get $0 of federal funding for recovery.
Yeah, because
that's
we're spending it all arguing about wolves and bears.
We're prioritizing where we're spending the money. A huge chunk of it goes to salmon and a bunch of other species that are, anyway. So we know that prioritization is going to happen. The question that is maybe worthy of debate, and probably not here right now because it could go on forever, but and maybe one of the concerns with doing this economic analysis is, should that prioritization be based on the economic impact to people, or should that prioritization be based upon the value and the likelihood of being able to biologically recover a species? So what species are in most need and could benefit the most from the dollars, or versus what humans could benefit the most from having a particular species recovered? And that's a serious discussion.
You have to take
and prioritization on species recovery.
Then you carry the one, and then then cubed. Right. And that's how you figure that out.
All I'm saying is that's a discussion for another day, obviously.
It is tough.
But that's one of the concerns with
it's challenging, isn't it?
With collecting the economic data, that it could be used to prioritize, for example, the economic concerns of people over the biological needs of species. And so since we're saying pros and cons to things, I'm just throwing that out as that's a perceived con of
having the data.
Having that data.
Yeah, and once again, you're right. Again, I fear, comes in as like this concern. It's like, okay, if we have that information, I fear how it may be
I think there could just be equally as many people saying, I'm glad I know that number, because now companies are stepping up and addressing whatever, the problem was, or people are donating additional dollars outside of tax dollars to do conservation because they see the significant economic impact.
Potential impact.
It could go a number of ways,
I think of sage
it's just
grouse.
Additional information in the marketplace of ideas that may spur folks along for innovation. Maybe not. Maybe it's used for nefarious purposes. I just don't think we as a country fall in the trap of negativity too often. We just say, okay, let's get all the information out there to know.
Interesting problem. Interesting issue.
Anyway, I think those are the main pieces we wanted to hit on this subject. Right? There's, like I said, there are 36 changes in here. We could run through pros and cons of all of them, but these are I think we've touched on what I'd call the most controversial, the highest profile ones, and certainly I think what we've tried to highlight is there could be some benefits to each one of them. There could be some negative consequences to each one of them. It really depends on how they're implemented. I can tell you, I got to give this final plug, and then you guys have your, whatever you want to finish up with here. But
I'm ready.
Here's something that's really bothered me. So we're in divisive times, politically divisive times. Although, when you read the historical record,
not even close. Yeah, we're not even close.
Yeah. But there's a lot of division and the polarization and so forth. And there's with this president in particular, I've noticed, especially since I work in this conservation field, I've noticed that anytime this administration proposes anything, the immediate response is negative from the sporting and conservation communities. It immediately moves to that point. And that bothers me. And maybe the administration does have nefarious intent. We don't know. We can't peel that curtain back and really know for sure. But at the end of the day, the regulations are going to be in place either for a very long time, and future administrations are going to have the opportunity to implement them, or a future administration is get to come in and say, you know what, we have different policy ideas. We're going to change that regulation.
Or within a month, it gets shut down by a court.
Or a court.
Injunction.
Yeah, right. There's that third option, and that's we already know that these regulations are going to be challenged in court.
Sure.
But my point is really, you have to look beyond the administration.
Yeah.
You can't look through the prism of having such disdain for an administration that you can't objectively look at a regulatory package and see where it might have opportunity to do positive things. And it's fair to look at it under a critical eye as well. But I think you need to look at both sides of that regulation and see, okay, is there an opportunity for it to do good? And if there is an opportunity for it to do good, then start advocating for that position and put pressure on the administration to implement it a certain way. The regulations are always written with a certain amount of flexibility for a reason, so they can be interpreted and applied, pretty broadly. Anyway, it bothers me a lot. You can not support the administration all you want. I'm not saying don't support everything that happens. I'm just saying sometimes I think we look through, and we're guilty of it in every administration, but sometimes I think we look through this prism of just how it applies to this administration rather than taking a bigger look at the big picture. And that's just my thought. I think we need to look at the bigger picture.
Thank you, Dave. It's nice to have you on board the ship. I'll tell you what I'm bothered by.
Don't even know what that means, but it's funny.
I do. I'll explain later.
Okay, I think I know what it means too.
You know what? This is it's very frustrating because I feel there are so many important things to do and work on. When we pile on, when people, and this is a trend that is worsening right now. This year's been terrible. People piling on things that don't really, that don't matter that much, and just being, just so extreme about it. It makes it much harder to have an effective voice when it's time to weigh in on making real changes. And I think and I know why people do it. But the concern I have is this, specifically on the Endangered Species Act. I'll bring this up. Some really, really great people have worked hard to actually try and get some substantive changes to the Endangered Species Act to make it more durable, to make it more effective, to make it last, to give that old car a new coat of paint so it can last for another, however,
preach, baby, preach.
So here's the problem. So if you think about this. So now for partisanship, for the sake of partisanship, and many people are doing this, they are going to attack like these, what are some tweaks, some minor changes, even things that the courts have said Interior needs to do here. Like, what happens now? We got to make some real changes someday, people. We actually need to really fix some things that are bigger than this. if we poison the well with this type of rhetoric, and not just on ESA, but if we do this on issues like our public lands and other things, if we are poisonous on things that are, if we're inventing things to be angry about, what happens when we really have something to be angry about? Or what happens when we really have something that we need to be positive about and move forward with? When we use all of our political ammunition, if you will, like people become numb to our voice. And that, I guess that's the sign of the times. That's what everybody does. We see it like saturation bombing, but at some point, we will regret it. That's my fear.
I think we're there. I'm already numb with it. So, anyways, so my point is,
are you numb with this podcast or are you numb with,
no, just the noise, his point of not keeping our powder dry for the important things, to steal another gun analogy for you. No, I think we've jumped the shark.
I like it.
We've gone beyond in not really focusing on the things that matter most. But
now
that's the way that is.
Species recovery matters a lot.
Yeah, but that's not what we're saying. We're not.
No, we're talking about rhetoric.
No, I know. So I'm just making sure.
The problem is we're never going to get there.
I'm just laying it out there that we all agree that species recovery matters.
Well, it
right?
depends on the species.
Yeah. I mean,
you son of a.
Yeah. No, you guys have already said it.
You got to do the analysis first. Let's get the economics out.
Yeah. Good point about we've gone too far. Good point, Dave, about focus. If there's positives available within some of these things, focus on making sure they do the positive thing. I think that we've seen that where enough people get in and advocate for the positive result that it does happen. It takes effort, right? And so that's why a lot of people want to get their security blanket and say, just don't ever let them have that discretion. Make sure it always ends up this way. That's our preconceived only way to handle things. And having that availability and pushing for the positive side of things is a good thing. And I think ultimately, if folks have listened to this episode and wonder what half of what we were talking about, go back to episodes 9, 11, and 13 for the Endangered Species Act, part 1, 2, and 3, to give kind of the ground floor, ESA 101, or whatever we called it, 1001, back in the day. That was like a year ago.
It was a year ago.
Yeah.
So
you can get CLE credits. So
CLE
right.
Meaning if you're
don't
a lawyer,
be lazy. Just
if you're a lawyer, you can continually and you're in Wyoming.
Thank us later.
Yeah.
If you're a Wyoming lawyer looking for not ethics credit, but continuing legal education credit, you can get them with those episodes.
We can't help you with your ethics.
That's right. All right, that's all I had. I'm my head's still in the wilderness and still fishing. So
yeah, I just build on one thing you said, and then I wish I was fishing too.
Yeah.
And now I'm drifting, but my mind just started drifting. But and it's building on what you said and what I said. But look at if there's a positive angle, look at it. If you're worried about the negative angle, accountability, hold the administration accountable. We have systems set up to be able to do that. Both legal, political, there's all systems for accountability. Mm-hmm. So that's the only thing I'd add on. But did you say this is a complicated issue?
He said it at one time. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's challenging.
Well, he also said the sky's not falling.
Hey, let me add this at the end. So there's a ton more to this. We just touched the surface. If there's anything in this that you think, you know what, I want to deep dive. I want to know about something about these regulations in greater detail.
Yeah. If you email me, I'll ignore you.
Email us. Email us at yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. We'll try and go out. We could maybe do it, but we'll actually go out and try and find an expert in the field that might come on and be able to do a deep dive on one of these things. That can provide an analysis.
This is Dave's cry for help right now. So if anybody's thinking about doing this, like he was so excited about this idea that we just spend hours and hours on the Endangered Species Act again. He was just like a small child when we were starting this podcast. So this is why he's throwing this out. He's like, "Oh, please, God!" He's just praying.
I'm fascinated with the act.
Let some young
No,
Jedi.
All right, whatever. You made your point, but all I'm saying is,
go listen to the old podcast.
We're open to not only on this, but if there are other things you want to have us record, like we've said a bunch of times, reach out to us, let us know. Say, hey, I'd like to get your perspective on this, and we'll do our best to provide it in a future episode. So yeah, please email us at yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. And as we say frequently, find us on all of our social media at the handle at It's Your Mountain. And please get out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you've been casually listening. You're like, I don't know if I can make that kind of a commitment to subscribe.
I'm just right there.
I'm just not that into commitment. I have this fear of commitment. And so you've been dating us for a while. Take that next step. Commit. Hit subscribe. And then if you haven't done it yet, please go out there and give us that 5-star rating. Send us a review. Like I said, like we've said, that's the kind of stuff that motivates us to keep producing this content.
And I want to give you just I want people to know, like, as I joke with you about this, here's a reality. You check for people. Hey, love us, hate us on this podcast. While I was dorking around with the Clean Water Act or something else, two of the people at this table were absolutely in the trenches on everything ESA. And I mean, to an extent that, like, the level of knowledge you guys have on, I mean, I talk about it, I ask about it, I joke about it. But for people, don't dismiss. I mean, please, give it some consideration when, go back and listen to it. But, like, Dave, I mean, I have a ton of respect for your knowledge of this. And Mike, I mean, it's no joke. And so, and it's one of the reasons why, like, when we sat down and started talking about this, I said, okay, guys, what do you think? Because I know what I think when I read stuff. But I know that, I trust the technical input that I get from you guys. And, it's one of the reasons that just it reaffirms my disappointment. Because I'm like, yeah, you talk to experts in this field, they come away with these same opinions and the same takeaways. I mean, we can do better.
Yeah, I agree with you. Headlines are causing problems. Yeah. Some headlines are causing problems, but
fake news. I just wanted to be able to say it just once.
I don't want to say it because we're kind of providing news, and I don't want people to start hashtagging us as fake news.
Hashtag.
We're trying to provide some some levity.
I want hashtag eternal truth.
I don't know if we're providing truth, but I'd like to think that we're providing some
hashtag everyone's got an opinion.
Some other perspectives.
Yeah.
So you can see the whole picture. That's one of the things we pride
thanks,
ourselves on.
Thanks for diving into this, man. It was a good subject.
Hey, I appreciate the compliment. I'm glad it's recorded because that doesn't happen very often.
It won't again.
But you're probably right. So I really am glad it's recorded. And everybody, thanks for listening. You'll catch us next time. And until then, remember, life is about experiences, so go have one.